I hadn't seen my son in almost 2 years, and when he called me out of the blue inviting me up to Seattle for a visit, I told myself it was just another chance to bridge the widening distance between us. 6 hours on the road from Portland to his townhouse in Belltown left my back screaming at every pothole, but when I finally pulled into his street and stepped out into the damp, cool air of the city, I felt something heavier than fatigue press down on me. I pulled my old leather suitcase from the trunk, the slam echoing against the quiet row of houses. The familiar metallic thud of the Ford's trunk used to be a sound of comfort, routine, steady, reliable. Tonight, it felt like a warning. "Dad," my son's voice broke across the yard. Too bright, too rehearsed. Lance came bounding down the porch steps with his arms spread wide, the way he used to greet me as a boy. But something about it was off. His smile was stretched too tightly across his face, like plastic wrap over spoiled meat, glossy, convincing from a distance, but hiding something rotten underneath. He reached for my suitcase, hands trembling, fumbling with the handle as if it weighed more than it did. "I've got it," I muttered, holding on, refusing to let him take the weight from me. His eyes darted away like a guilty man caught under a spotlight. "You okay, son?" I asked quietly. "Perfect," he said, wiping his sweaty palms against his jeans. "Just really glad you're here." His voice cracked on the last word. "Lucinda's making that lasagna you love." From the open windows of the townhouse drifted the smell of garlic and herbs, warm and inviting. Through the glass I caught sight of my daughter-in-law, auburn hair aglow in the falling light, as she moved around the kitchen. She looked content, unaware of the storm brewing on the porch. At least someone in this family seemed genuinely happy to see me. But Lance's grip on my elbow told a different story. Too tight, too urgent. "Dad," he whispered, voice dropping low, "we need to talk. Seriously." I stopped, suitcase hanging heavy at my side. "Then let's talk now." "No, not now." He shook his head fast, like he was trying to shake off the words themselves. That fake smile snapped back into place. "Too wide, too bright. Get settled first. Rest after the drive. Dinner, then we'll sit down." His voice faltered, but his meaning lingered in the air like cigarette smoke. Whatever conversation he wanted, it wasn't going to be easy. Years of running an auto parts shop had taught me how to read people, how to spot the signs of a man drowning in debt or in lies. My son was broadcasting distress like a radio tower. Every flick of his hands, every twitch of his lips, every tremor in his voice. "Lance," Lucinda's voice broke in, warm and unsuspecting as she appeared in the doorway, flower on her apron. "Everything all right out there?" "Everything's great," Lance called back, voice unnaturally high. "Dad just arrived." She waved to me with that same kindness she always carried, her green eyes soft and welcoming. "Orval, how was the drive? You must be exhausted." I waved back, forcing a smile, though my gaze never left my son. He jangled his car keys in his fist, the metallic clinking and nervous rhythm that set my teeth on edge. "The drive was fine," I called back to her, then lowered my voice so only Lance could hear. "Son, whatever's eating at you, we can handle it. We're family." For a fleeting moment, the mask slipped. His eyes flashed raw panic, desperation naked on his face, before he swallowed it down and pasted that smile back into place. "I know, Dad. I know we can figure this out. That's why." He cut himself short, darting a look toward Lucinda. "That's why I'm glad you came." The question, "figure what out?" burned in my chest, but he was already tugging me toward the house, jittery as a man waiting for a verdict. I followed him up the porch, suitcase in hand, unease tightening in my stomach like a fist. The Seattle air smelled of rain. Yes, but also of trouble. Something I couldn't name but could feel seeping into my bones. The guest bedroom upstairs felt smaller than I remembered. I unpacked my shirts methodically, smoothing them against the rod with the care of a man trying to control at least one corner of his world. 40 years of living alone after Martha died had taught me the importance of order, of filling silence with busy hands so the mind didn't wander too far into shadows. But Lance's behavior pressed on me, a splinter I couldn't shake free. I shook 2 blood pressure pills into my palm, the doctor's warnings echoing in my ears. "Stress kills at 65, he'd said, and yet stress seemed to hunt me down regardless. Through the window, I caught movement. Lance stood in the backyard, shoulders hunched, a cigarette dangling from his lips. My son, who had always mocked smokers, now dragging deep, frantic pulls of nicotine into his lungs. Lucinda despised cigarettes, couldn't even pass one on the street without wrinkling her nose. And yet here he was, chain-smoking in the dusk like a man trying to quiet a storm inside his chest. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, watching him pace. His free hand raked through his carefully styled hair until it stood on end. He stubbed out the cigarette, only to light another instantly, his movements jittery and raw. The phone call from last month replayed in my mind, his vague talk about financial trouble, unexpected expenses, hard times. I'd offered help. He brushed me off, said everything was under control, but the sight of him tonight told a different truth. I lowered myself onto the bed, the springs groaning, my chest tightening despite the pills. The house hummed with ordinary life, pots clattering downstairs, Lucinda humming softly, the television muttering about weather. But beneath it all I felt the thrum of something wrong, something coming. I'd seen this look before, back in the shop, customers circling their words, unable to ask for help straight out, their nervous laughter and sweaty palms, betraying desperation they couldn't mask. Desperate people don't just make bad choices, they make dangerous ones. Rain began tapping against the glass, steady and soft, like Seattle's eternal lullaby. Outside, my son lit yet another cigarette. My gut clenched. Whatever he was tangled in, it wasn't small, and whatever it was about to pull me down with him. Orville, Lucinda's cheerful voice rose up the stairs. Dinner's ready. I stood, straightened my shirt, and told myself I was ready to face whatever this night was hiding. I lingered at the window a moment longer, watching Lance stub out his second cigarette with the quick, angry jab of a man trying to bury more than just ash. His shoulders squared, that familiar set I'd seen countless times when he was a boy, right before a confession. Right before the words, "Dad, I broke it," or "Dad, I'm in trouble." But this wasn't about broken baseball windows or scraped knees on the schoolyard. This was something bigger, darker, the kind of trouble that didn't just sting for a day but cut deep enough to alter the rest of a man's life. When I finally made my way downstairs, the dining room greeted me with a false warmth that felt like a trap disguised as home. The smell of Lucinda's cooking wrapped around me instantly, lasagna rich and bubbling, thick layers of cheese and meat sauce crowned by a golden crust that could have tempted a king. She'd gone so far as to light candles, the flames flickering gently, casting shadows that danced across the old mahogany table she had inherited from her grandmother. The effort she had poured into the evening only deepened the pit in my stomach. It was as if she were trying to anchor us in normalcy, while the ground beneath us crumbled. "This looks incredible," I said, forcing a smile as I sank into my chair. The words felt like stage lines from a script we were all pretending to believe in. Family dinner, laughter, warmth. It should have been real. Instead, it was a performance. Each of us playing parts, none of us fooling the others. Lance poured the wine, his hands trembling so badly the bottle tilted and crimson drops splattered against the white tablecloth. He muttered a curse, fumbling with his napkin to blot the stains. The red spread anyway, soaking into the cloth like blood refusing to disappear. "Rough day at work?" I asked, keeping my voice even though my pulse had quickened. "Something like that," he muttered, without looking me in the eye. His attempt at steady composure was laughable. Still, he managed to fill the glasses without further catastrophe, setting the bottle down with exaggerated care, as though it might explode. We slipped into safe topics, all three of us clinging to the illusion of normal. Lance asked about the shop, and I told him about keeping old cars alive for customers too stubborn or too poor to buy new ones. Lucinda talked about the library, her new book club initiative, her laugh brightening the room in a way that almost made me believe in the moment. She spooned generous squares of lasagna onto our plates, and I let the warmth of the food comfort me, if only for a few fleeting minutes. But across the table, my son only pushed the food around his plate. He cut his lasagna into smaller and smaller pieces, but never lifted them to his mouth. His fork scratched the porcelain with a soft, grating sound that set my nerves on edge. Outside, the rain picked up its tempo, drumming harder against the windows, a percussion that seemed to echo his restless tension. I was halfway through my serving when the breaking point came. Lance's fork hit his plate with a sharp, metallic clink that silenced Lucinda mid-sentence. He turned toward me, face pale in the candlelight, jaw locked, eyes hollow. "Dad," he said, his voice flat but urgent, slicing through the room like a blade. "We need to have that talk, now." Lucinda blinked, caught off guard, her smile faltering as if someone had snuffed it out with their fingers. "Lance," she murmured softly, "maybe after dinner." "No," he cut her off, sharp, final. "Now." The air thickened, charged. He stared at me, like a man about to jump off a ledge, as though the words waiting in his throat would kill him if he didn't let them out. "I need money, Dad. A lot of money." The room went silent, except for the relentless rain. I set my fork down slowly, each movement deliberate, my pulse pounding in my ears. "How much is a lot?" I asked, though dread was already curling its claws around my ribs. His lips pressed together before he exhaled the words like a confession dragged from the gallows. "More than $1 million." It was as if the air left the room. The words slammed into me with the weight of a hammer blow, knocking the breath from my chest. I searched his face for the flicker of a joke, some smirk, some crack in the facade that would let me dismiss this as exaggeration. But there was nothing, only desperation, raw and unyielding. "Are you out of your mind?" My voice cracked under the strain, rough, disbelieving. "I've done the calculations," he pressed on, ignoring my fury, speaking with the cold precision of a man who had rehearsed this plea. "Your business is worth about $600,000, maybe more if you find the right buyer. The house in Portland should bring another $400. Add your savings, your retirement accounts. You want me to sell everything?" My throat tightened, until my words came out strangled. "Lose everything I've worked my whole life to build, because of your mistakes." The table's warm glow felt cruel now, the candles mocking the sudden fracture in the room. Across from me, Lucinda sat frozen, her face drained of color, her fork resting untouched. She was staring at her husband as though she'd never seen him before in her life. "They're not just mistakes, Dad." His voice was softer now, almost pleading, and in his eyes I saw it. The storm I had only glimpsed before now breaking open, threatening to drag us all into its heart. "This is serious. Life and death serious." He leaned forward, fingers splayed on the table as if he needed the wood to steady him. Candlelight carved hard shadows into the hollows of his cheeks. His eyes were wild and rimmed with red. "I borrowed money from the wrong people," he said, "and now they want it back. With interest. Lots of interest." "Who did you borrow from?" I asked. Every line of me tightened like a coiled spring. "That doesn't matter," he snapped. "What matters is I need over $1 million, and I need it fast. You're the only person who can help me." The words landed like a slap. I pushed back from the table until the chair legs scraped the hardwood and sparks seemed to fly from the sound. I'd spent 40 years building something honest with my hands and my head, an auto parts shop that kept a half-dozen families fed, a home that stood through storms, an account with enough to keep me secure in the autumn of my life. I wasn't about to gut it on a reckless son's desperate gamble. "I'm not destroying my life to fix yours," I said, each syllable deliberate. "Dad, please," he begged, voice cracking. There was a thinness to it that made my chest ache in a way I hadn't expected. "You don't understand what these people will do if I don't pay them back." "Then you should have thought about that before you borrowed their money," I said. The sentence was harder than I meant it to be. I heard it echo in the room and felt my own father's voice, stern, unforgiving, rise up inside me for an instant. Lucinda swallowed and finally found her voice. "Lance," she said, almost pleading, "what are you talking about? What people? How much did you—" He ignored her, eyes pinned to mine like a man begging the ocean to part. "I'm your son, your only son. Doesn't that mean anything?" For a heartbeat the room tilted. Fathers and sons. What did that word mean when it was measured in ledgers and losses? "It means everything," I told him quietly. "But it doesn't mean I'm going to bankrupt myself because you made bad choices." Silence fell so thick I could hear the rain. The candles guttered, their flames bending as though in sympathy. The mahogany table, the family relic, the thing that had held birthdays and bills and the occasional fight, seemed suddenly too small for the heat that filled the room. "I can lend you 200,000, I said at last. It came out practical, a balance of compassion and borders. Cash, no questions asked. That's my limit. I watched the hope leave his face, and the expression that replaced it curdled to something almost feral. 200,000, he laughed, short, incredulous. The sound of a man without future. Dad, that's not even close. His hands slammed on the table in a motion that made plates jump and wine glasses tremble. Red slashed across the linen like an accusation. You never supported me, he spat, voice raw. When I needed you, you were always too busy with your precious business. The accusation landed and then rolled, finding old wounds I'd kept bandaged. High school football. Yes, I'd missed when last-minute orders came up. His college graduation, an emergency parts order had pulled me away. But the weight of those memories did not justify what he asked now. I sat very still. 40 years of dealing with desperate customers had taught me the same lesson over and over. Desperation can dress itself like righteousness and call it a virtue. Manipulation has a smell. It is the same tang on a man's breath when he's about to take what isn't his. That's not true, I said quietly, and tried to mean it. I was there when it mattered, Lance. I've paid for school books, band fees, late-night calls when you were sick. I did my best. You did whatever you wanted, he cut in, the desperation sharpening into anger. You chose inventory over me. You chose shipments and ledgers. And now when I'm facing real danger, you offer me scraps. His voice rose until it filled the ceiling beams, shaking the pictures on the wall. Lucinda began to cry softly. At first a hiccuping sound, then quiet sobs that trembled through the room like a small animal in a storm. Her hands trembled as she reached for her napkin, and pressed it into her palms as if to hold herself together. For a second I saw them both as I had once seen him, a boy with knees forever scabbed, and a laugh that started in his chest and spilled bright. That sight pained me more than any insult, but sympathy is a thin bridge when the other side wants to cross it on a demand for ruin. Listen to me, I said, leaning across the table so that my voice was low and steel-edged. I won't watch you burn us down. I will not be the man who loses everything because you chose to gamble with life and other people's patience. You don't get it, he barked. They don't give second chances. They don't take promises. They take people. The sentence hung there, half-formed, as if the worst of it was too true to speak aloud. The room seemed to contract around that possibility. Who were they? What did they mean by take? My throat tightened. Then tell me who they are, I demanded. Tell me what you owe. Tell me how this happened. He flinched at the demand, like a man struck. For a breath he looked younger than his years, afraid, cornered, and then his face went hard again, and he stood so suddenly the chair toppled backward with a thud. I can't, he started, then stopped himself as if the words would burn his tongue. Lucinda sobbed openly now, wiping her eyes with trembling hands. The candles burned lower. The rain outside intensified, stamping against the glass as if the weather wanted to drown out what was happening inside. In that moment I realized this was no longer simply about money. It had the shape of something uglier. Threats whispered in alleys. Men whose business was to make other people's nights go wrong. Contracts signed in panic that you can't paper over with apologies. I sat back, palms flat on the table, feeling the grain under my skin like the lines of a map I knew by heart. The part of me that had sold parts and fixed engines for decades began to assess the situation like a work order. What was broken, what tools I had, what the risk of repair would be. 200,000 could buy time. It could be a plaster to cover a bleeding wound long enough to find another doctor, but it would not buy absolution, and it would not buy safety if the men on the other end wanted blood and not dollars. I looked at my son, my only son, who met my gaze with something like apology and defiance all tangled together. You've always been reckless, I said softly, but you're not getting a blank check. He slammed his fist into his palm, the sound final. You'll regret this, he hissed, and turned away, shoulders rigid as he stormed from the room. Lucinda's sobs followed him like an echo. I stayed seated, feeling the house settle like a patient after fever, every board and beam quiet except for the rain. I had given him what I could, 200,000 in cash, no questions asked. It was a compromise, a rope thrown into dark water, but it wasn't the rope he wanted. And as I sat there, watching the candle smoke curl upward, a cold clarity settled over me. Whatever had landed in Lance's life wasn't a problem I could solve with money and good intentions alone. It was bigger, and it smelled like danger. Outside, somewhere down the street, a car passed and sprayed water against the curb. The sound was ordinary and cruel, an indifferent world going on while ours frayed at the edges. I folded my hands on the table and tried to steady my breathing. The night was only beginning. "I can lend you 200,000, I repeated, slow and steady, keeping my voice level as if some part of me were trying to anchor the night. Cash. No questions asked. Earn the rest yourself. Earn it." Lance gave a laugh that tasted like rust and old hurt. It crawled up my spine. "Dad, I don't have time to earn it," he said, eyes burning. He shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the floor and began to pace behind the table like an animal in a trap. Candlelight from the center of the table threw the shadows of his hands huge and twitching against the wall, making him look stranger than he was, bigger, more dangerous. "You have no idea what it's like," he said, voice breaking halfway through, "living with that weight all the time, knowing any day they might decide I've had enough time. 200,000 is nothing to them. It's an insult." "Then maybe you shouldn't have borrowed from them in the first place," I said, and the calm in my tone felt brittle even to my own ears. It didn't soothe him. If anything, it fed the fire. He grabbed the wine glass, and for a terrifying moment I thought he might hurl it. Instead, he swallowed the contents in one fluid, ugly gulp. The red left a smear on his lips. "Easy to say for someone who never took a real risk in his life," he spat. "You played it safe. Sold parts to the same customers for decades. Never dreamed big. Never reached for anything beyond your little corner of Portland." The accusation struck because it contained a shard of truth. After Martha died, I had tightened my belt and built a life out of steady work and small certainties. I chose the dependable over the dangerous because I couldn't bear more loss. Those choices kept roofs over our heads. They bought Lance a college degree and steady meals. They were the scaffolding of our lives. "Those choices put food on your table," I snapped back, the words sharper than I intended. "They paid for your school books. They built the business that lets me help you now." Lucinda's sobs grew louder, thin, frightened sounds that tore through the room. She pushed away from the table, clutching her arms around herself as if to keep from unraveling. "Please," she whispered, "to both of us, to the house, to whatever would listen. Both of you, please stop." But Lance had gone beyond hearing please. He leaned forward so his forehead almost brushed mine. The proximity made my skin crawl. "You know what Mom would say if she were here," he demanded. "She'd tell you to help your son. She'd tell you family comes before business." Martha's name landed like a fist. For a moment I felt the old ache raw and present, and I swallowed the reflex to answer with grief. Instead, I steadied myself on a principle she would have respected too: responsibility. "Your mother would also have said to own up to your mistakes, rather than blame everyone else," I said. He exploded. "My mistakes?" His voice was almost a scream. "What about your mistakes, Dad? What about all the times you chose work over family? Missed my games, left early from my graduation? Where were you when it mattered?" The list stung. Not because it was untrue, but because I'd never known how to be both provider and presence at the same time. I had tried. I had failed. But failure didn't absolve reckless choices. Lucinda stood abruptly, her chair skidding backward. Her mascara left dark streaks down her face, making her look older, more worn than the woman who had welcomed me in the afternoon. "Enough," she said, sharp, unexpected authority cutting through our storm. "Both of you. Just stop it right now." Her voice was the kind of thing that made arguments stumble. Hers was the cool center between two raging fires. Lance's mouth snapped closed mid-sentence. I felt myself, on reflex, take a half-step back. She wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand and then folded her arms as if she were placing a handrail around the chaos. "This isn't solving anything," she continued, voice trembling but steady. "You're both exhausted and saying things in anger you don't mean. Everyone needs to go rest. Calm down." She looked at Lance with something that was a mix of fear and steel. "I need time to process," she added, softer, directed at both of us. Her plea landed like a benediction. For the first time all evening the sound of rain outside felt less like an intruder, and more like a curtain we could draw across what had been said. I met Lucinda's eyes and really saw her. The dark circles under her eyes, the tight line of her mouth, the way her hands trembled when she tried to make small talk while a storm brewed around her husband. She'd been carrying this for weeks, it seemed. The panic had been living in her house long before I arrived. "Lucinda's right," I said, and the apology unclenched from a place in my chest I hadn't known was holding. "I'm sorry for the shouting, Lucy. This isn't what I wanted for tonight." My voice softened. I reached out instinctively, the old reflex of wanting to fix, to soothe. It was a small gesture, but it felt necessary. She nodded, not fully reassured, but steadier. Lance stood a few feet away, fists white at his sides, breathing like a man who'd been swimming under ice. He met my gaze once, no pleading this time, only an unreadable hardness, and then he walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a muffled click that sounded like the end of something. The house exhaled. The candles thinned, their flames guttering toward the wax. Outside the rain kept time on the roof, indifferent and steady. I sat back down at the table, the 200,000 I'd offered burning in my pocket like a promise and a threat both. It would buy time, maybe enough to find a solution, maybe only enough to delay whatever was coming. Either way, it wasn't the end. I folded my hands on the table and let the silence fill the spaces between my thoughts. This family, my son, his wife, were tangled in something that didn't respect good intentions or past sacrifices. I'd offered what I could without burning the house down. That was the limit tonight. But as the rain drew the night in around the little townhouse, I realized limits were fragile things when desperate men were counting on your mercy. And desperate men, I knew from the shop, could do dangerous things. She managed a weak, tired smile. I know you both love each other even when you're fighting like this." For a second Lance looked smaller, like the frightened boy who used to crawl between Martha and me when thunder woke him. He ran his hands through his hair, undoing the careful shape he'd worn since the afternoon, and for a breath I saw every scraped knee and whispered apology he'd ever given. "Fine," he muttered. "Maybe some space would be good." He started toward the living room, then paused, turned and threw one last look over his shoulder. "But Dad, this conversation isn't over. We need to find a solution." "We will," I said, though the word felt thin and uncertain on my tongue. I wasn't sure what solution looked like anymore, what form salvation took when the people demanding it wore masks and spoke in threats. Lance nodded once, curt, and climbed the stairs. His footsteps thudded heavy, a slow, deliberate drumbeat that stopped suddenly when his bedroom door slammed. The blow rattled picture frames in the hallway and left the house feeling hollow. Lucinda moved silently to clear the table. "I'll take care of this," she said, but her hands were anything but steady. Plates clinked with a mechanical precision, a small ritual to keep the panic at bay. "It helps me think." I watched her, a young woman who had married into our hard, imperfect family and now had to carry the weight of problems she never signed up for. The lasagna went untouched, cool and congealed on the serving dish like a memory of a meal that should have been. What was meant to be a welcome dinner had become a reckoning. "Thank you," I said finally, for intervening, for the small civility she'd tried to preserve. She paused with the stack of plates against her chest, and looked back at me with something like rueful exhaustion. "He's scared, Orval. More scared than I've ever seen him. I don't know what kind of trouble he's in, but it's eating him alive." Her confession landed with the force of truth. Then she turned back to her work and I started up the stairs, knees complaining with each step as if they were reminding me of every mile I'd ever driven. The hallway was dim. Only a nightlight near the bathroom pushed back some of the dark, and Lance's door stayed shut, no sliver of light under it. Still, I could hear him moving inside. The restless pacing, the drawer opening and closing, the bed springs protesting as he sat and stood and sat again. No sleep for him tonight. No sleep for me either, it seemed. In the guest room I sat heavily on the bed and felt the years settle into me like silt in a jar. Seattle's evening blurred into watercolor outside the window, street lights flickering on, rain turning the city into a smear of gold and gray. I dug my wallet from my back pocket, and the familiar weight of it startled me. Thicker tonight somehow, bulked up with a decision that might save a life or ruin the rest of mine. Behind my driver's license, Martha's photograph smiled up at me, frozen in a moment of laughter from 12 years ago. I'd carried that image in my wallet like a talisman since the cancer took her. It had kept me steady through the small and large decisions a life demanded. "What would you do, sweetheart?" I whispered to her picture. "How do we help without enabling? How do we protect him without losing ourselves?" There was no answer but the low hum of the dishwasher downstairs and the steady patter of rain. I thought of Lance at 7, insisting the tooth fairy leave a silver dollar. I remembered him at 16 rehearsing a prom speech in the kitchen light. I saw him at 22 full of diplomas and promises. Somewhere between those bright photographs and the man who demanded $1 million tonight, something had been twisted. Bad choices perhaps, or worse. The way he dismissed 200,000 as scraps told me more than his pleas ever could. This was not a failed venture or a maxed-out credit card. This was debt that smelled of danger. 200,000 is life-changing money for most men. For him it was a token. That casual contempt for what could have safeguarded a dozen retirements rang alarms in me. Whoever he'd borrowed from wasn't interested in ledgers or payment plans. They were interested in leverage, the kind of leverage that didn't stop at bank accounts. I sat with the cash's imagined weight on my palm, an envelope, a clean stack of bills, the smell of ink and paper. It could buy time. It might buy breathing room, a way to negotiate, to hide, to run. But money alone couldn't buy safety if the men at the other end wanted proof of submission or something more permanent. I'd fixed engines and rebuilt transmissions for 40 years. I knew how to take something broken and make it run again. I didn't know how to mend a life already tangled with people who profited from fear. Still, I had to try. I could not let fear be the final voice between us. I would give him what I could without burning everything down, but I would not hand over my years without conditions. I would not let my life be the sacrifice for his recklessness. There were ways to help that demanded thought, not haste, contracts, accounts frozen until terms were met, meetings in public places, legal counsel. Even now in the quiet of the guest room I began tallying options like a mechanic checking parts, who to call, what to freeze, which bank accounts could be protected, which assets could be shielded. I pictured the bartender I'd met earlier that evening at the pub, how his hand had grabbed my arm, his whisper a spark of some other truth I'd only half heard. The image slid across my thoughts like a shadow. There were threads here I didn't yet see. Someone had pulled at them. Someone else had tied knots. Whoever they were, they didn't respect family or nostalgia. They respected leverage and fear. I closed my wallet. The photograph of Martha pressed between my fingers like a benediction, and I made a quiet promise to myself. I would help my boy enough to keep him breathing, but I would also find out who had him on that leash. I would not be a passive victim of some criminal's appetite. I was a man who had spent a lifetime making things run, who had learned how to take what was broken and fix it. If this thing, the thing gnawing at my son, could be fixed, I'd find the fault and I'd wrench it free. If it couldn't be fixed, then I would make it my mission to make whoever put it there regret the day they chose my family as their target. The rain kept its steady rhythm against the glass. Upstairs, Lance's pacing slowed and then stopped. For the first time that night the house felt like it had a small, fragile center, an ember we could either smother or protect. I lay back on the pillow and stared at the ceiling, the plan beginning to form in the dark. Measured help, then investigation. Help first, then answers. And if answers led to threats, then I would be ready to answer back. At 65, you learn the math of time. There aren't enough hours to rebuild from zero. The business, the house, the retirement accounts. Those were 4 decades stitched together by mornings in the shop. Evenings filling out ledgers, the quiet work of keeping a life from falling apart. Lose them, and you become another old man on a lunch table, trading stories for spare change. Still, he was my son, the little boy who'd crawled into our bed when thunderstorms shook the house, the kid who'd wanted to learn how to change oil and balance a checkbook so he could be practical and proud. The boy Martha and I had tried to raise into something better than what sat across from me that night. I let the numbers run through my head like a mechanic checking tolerances. 200,000 was generosity, but it was a bandage. 300,000 would hurt, mortgages leveraged, retirement trimmed, credit lines stretched, but I could survive it and still keep something to call my own. It would be a painful compromise, but one that might keep my son breathing long enough to fix the rest of his life. The rain picked up its tempo against the window as if the city agreed with my urgency. I found myself thinking, habitually, like a businessman, weighing risks, measuring outcomes, eyeing the small margin that separated compassion from ruin. Practicality had been my compass since Martha died. Tonight it felt both useful and cruel. This wasn't a parts order that could be returned or an engine that could be rebuilt. This was my boy's life, potentially on the edge of something ugly. Downstairs, Lucinda moved through the ritual of cleaning, clinks of plates, the dishwasher's low hum, small efforts to stitch a frayed night back together. I could hear Lance too, his voice low and persuasive through the floorboards, the cadence of a salesman or a man bargaining with fate, probably trying to soften her, to make her a partner in his pleading. I slid Martha's photograph back into my wallet, felt the paper's cool corner against my thumb, and the decision snapped into place like ice underfoot. 300,000. Final offer. Enough to prove he mattered without handing over the estate. The thirst hit me then, a reminder that I was not immortal. My mouth went dry. My joints reminded me of a life of labor. I pushed myself up from the guest bed and shuffled downstairs, feet cool against the hardwood, fingers finding the banister, as if it were a map back to steadiness. The kitchen light above the sink cast a small warm pool across the granite. I turned the tap and let cold water run into my palms. The simple ritual grounded me. Dad, the voice from the living room was softer than the one at dinner. Lance emerged from the shadows like a man stepping out from behind something that had been hiding him. The street light through the front window painted him in thin silver. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with lack of sleep, like exhaustion had eaten at him from the inside out. "You okay?" I asked, glass raised to my lips. "Couldn't sleep," he said. He moved into the kitchen light, and I could see him for what he was, a man who had worn himself down arguing with ghosts and debts. The rage from the dining room had melted into something more vulnerable. He looked at me with the shame of a child who'd been caught, then with the courage to admit it. "Dad, I'm sorry," he said, before I could say anything else. The apology was raw, unpracticed. "I was cruel earlier. I said things I didn't mean. I blamed you for things that weren't your fault." His words hit me harder than his accusations had. There are apologies that clear the air and apologies that change everything. His felt like the latter. He stepped closer, and I noticed the old habits re-emerge. The small mannerisms that marked him as my son, the fidget of a thumb, the tilt of his head when he was trying to be honest. "You're my father," he continued, voice small. "You've given me everything, and when you deserved respect, I gave you demands and anger." He looked up at me then with something like hope. Would you go out with me? Just the two of us, have a beer, talk like people instead of firing at each other across a dining table." The invitation was a surprise. When had being friends with my boy become foreign to us both? But maybe Martha had been right about second chances. Maybe this was the kind of small, ordinary thing that could begin a repair. "All right," I heard myself say before doubt had time to sit in. "That sounds good." His smile changed him. The tension folded into something warm and almost boyish. He moved to the closet, grabbed his jacket and handed me mine the way he had done 100 times before when we were teaching batting averages and how to double-check a torque setting. "The Foggy Lantern," he said. "Not fancy, but good beer. They always have the game on. A memory unspooled. Us baseball on the TV. Him with a notebook tracking stats like they were treasures." The recollection warmed me more than the kitchen light. The pub lived up to its name. Amber light seeped through decades of smoke-stained wood, neon signs throwing colored ghosts across well-worn booths. The air smelled faintly of hops and old newspapers, of spilled beer and quiet arguments about ball players whose names meant nothing outside this neighborhood. Marvin the bartender, middle-aged, stocky, with temples frosted like a salt shaker, polished glasses with the economy of a man who'd learned to listen more than to speak. 2 drafts, Lance said with a familiarity that told me he had been here before. Marvin didn't ask questions. He set 2 pints in front of us like peace offerings, cold, a little bitter, clean enough to cut through the night. We sat side by side at the bar while the Mariners scuffled on the TV above, down by 3 in the 7th inning, and the room gave the occasional chorus of commentary to the play. For the first time that evening, the noise felt ordinary in a way that tasted like relief. The beer's bite opened something inside me, and I let the quiet of the pub settle around us like a blanket. Lance talked first, small talk like the loosening of a knot. Then he began to unspool the story again, softer and more measured than at dinner. The wrong people, he said. Loans taken out in blind panic, promises made on nothing but fear. I listened. He fumbled with his glass, the same nervous motion he'd used at the table, but without the performative anger. Tonight, the desperation was worn like a bruise you could see through his shirt. I kept my face steady, the way I'd learned to keep faces steady in the shop when customers came in with empty wallets and full tempers. I didn't promise what I couldn't deliver. I told him the number, 300,000, and watched his face as if I were checking a tire's tread for a hairline crack. The expression that crossed him was complicated relief, yes, but also a new kind of fear. He had expected either capitulation or a total refusal. My compromise sat between. For a while we talked about other things. The Mariners' chances, a mechanic we both knew who'd retired, small things that patched the night into an ordinary evening. But beneath each sentence was an undertow of the thing that had brought me into town. Who lent him money like that? Who counted interest in bones? The bartender, Marvin, kept a steady eye on Lance now and then. Seasoned bar staff learned to watch the way customers change when they're carrying trouble. When we left the Foggy Lantern, the rain had eased to a steady drizzle. Lance walked me to my car, and for a fragile moment we were just father and son again. 2 men with too many miles in their bones, talking about the small vicissitudes of life instead of shouting accusations at a table. He thanked me with a softness that was almost grief. I nodded, feeling the weight of my decision carve a line across my future. Back in the car, the engine's familiar growl was a comfort. The radio muttered the end of the game, and I drove slowly back to his townhouse, rain sketching streaks across the windshield. I had given a significant portion of what I had. It might buy him time. It might not, but it also bought me standing in a different place than I had been at dinner, connected and watchful instead of angry and stubborn. As I climbed the stairs to the guest room, I promised myself 2 things. First, to help him enough to survive the night, and second, to find out how his life had become tangled with people who counted their gains in fear. I had fixed 1,000 broken things in my life. Cars, friendships, sometimes marriages. I knew how to look under hoods, how to trace a problem to its source. This was different, yes, but the method is the same. Listen, observe, trace, and then act. The house was quiet when I slipped inside. Lucinda's lights extinguished, the hush of tiredness in the walls. I lay awake for a long time, the photograph of Martha on the bedside table catching moonlight in her laugh. Below me I could hear the faint scrape of a chair, the measured breathing of a man at war with himself. I thought about Marvin behind his bar, about the bartender in the earlier night who had grabbed my arm and murmured something that had settled like a stone in my gut. Threads, I thought. Pull at one, and you see where they go. 300,000 would start the pull. After that, I would begin to follow the string until it led me to the men who thought they could threaten a son into obedience. I didn't know what I would find. I only knew the kind of man I had been all my life. Practical, stubborn, and incapable of watching someone I loved be eaten alive without trying to do something about it. The next morning, I would call banks, lawyers, maybe an old friend from the days when favors were currency. For tonight, I let the rain lull me into an uneasy sleep, the outline of a plan forming like the faint blueprint of a repair I'd finished 1,000 times before. "Remember when we used to watch games together?" I asked, lowering myself onto the bar stool. The seat gave a little creak under my weight, the kind that made me think of all the years between now and then. "You must have been about 12. You kept pestering me about the infield fly rule until I thought I'd lose my patience." Lance's smile was sudden and unguarded, reaching his eyes for the first time all day. "Of course, Dad, you taught me to love baseball. Said it wasn't just about power, it was about patience, strategy, waiting for your pitch. That's still good advice for the game and for life." He lifted his glass in a small toast. "To second chances." I clinked my beer against his, the sound sharp and delicate in the hum of the bar. Something in my chest, tight as a vice since dinner, finally loosened. Maybe this was what we had needed all along. Neutral ground, away from the heavy air of Lucinda's house, away from family history hanging over us like storm clouds. Here, in this dim little place, with the smell of hops and fried onions in the air, he seemed more like my son again. Not the desperate stranger who'd stared at me across the dinner table, demanding I sign away my life's work. We drank and talked. He asked about the shop, about the regulars who always brought their cars in too late, and laughed when I told stories of customers who thought YouTube tutorials made them mechanics. He even remembered helping me one summer organize the parts inventory, sweating in the back room and trying to impress me with how quickly he could memorize numbers on a ledger. For a moment, the weight of his debts, his threats, the past years, it all receded, replaced by the kind of easy rhythm I thought was long gone. "I miss this," I admitted quietly, as Marvin appeared without a word and topped off our glasses. "Me too," Lance said, his tone softer now, a little wistful. He took a long pull from his beer before glancing too quickly toward the entrance. "Really missed it." Marvin kept wiping the bar with his practiced rhythm, but I noticed something shift in his eyes. He was watching Lance, not with idle curiosity, but with the sharp awareness of someone who'd seen too many nights go bad. It made me suddenly aware of my son's small tells, the fingers drumming against the condensation of his pint, the way his gaze kept flicking toward the door, the reflexive check of his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. "Everything all right, son?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Perfect," he answered, too fast, too bright, like a student bluffing through a question he hadn't studied for. "Just enjoying the evening. You know, sometimes you forget how good it feels to just sit and talk." On the TV, the Mariners stranded 2 runners, their hopes collapsing with a pop fly to center field. Marvin muted the game and reached for the remote, switching channels. The small action seemed to ratchet up Lance's nerves even higher. His eyes darted to the door again and he shifted on his stool. "Dad, excuse me for a minute," he said abruptly, fishing his phone from his pocket. "Restroom?" I asked, though the question felt hollow. "Yeah, maybe make a quick call." He was already halfway to the back, weaving through the tables, leaving his glass half full on the counter. I watched him go, my gut tightening with an unease I couldn't name. Maybe he was checking on Lucinda. Maybe he was fielding another creditor's call. Maybe something worse. Marvin reappeared in front of me, still wiping at a spot of wood that didn't need cleaning. "Nice evening for it," he said lightly. "For what?" "Father, son time," he replied, eyes cutting toward the back hallway where Lance had vanished. "Don't see much of that anymore." His tone shifted, just barely. "Your boy seems restless tonight." I opened my mouth, but before I could respond, Marvin leaned closer. The bartender mask, the easy smile, the conversational tone slid away. What was left was sharper, harder, like steel, under worn leather. His hand closed around my forearm, firm and urgent but not painful. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen carefully, old-timer, we need to talk." The words carried weight. My pulse slowed and sharpened all at once. "Your son was in here earlier today," Marvin said, every word carved with precision. "He wasn't alone. 3 men, I overheard enough to know they were talking about your elimination." The words struck me like ice water poured down my spine. "What?" I whispered.
That's impossible. Look for yourself. He reached under the counter, flipped a hidden switch, and a small monitor came alive on the bar's surface. Multiple camera angles showed the pub's interior and the street outside. Marvin tapped the screen, his fingers steady. There, he said. My blood turned to lead. The grainy feed of the exterior camera showed my son standing at the entrance, not now, but earlier in the day, talking with three men who could have stepped straight out of a crime novel. One was tall and lean, coiled with the stillness of a predator. Another was built thick and brutal, shoulders like a wall, hands like they were meant for breaking bones. The third had a casual menace, the kind of man who smiled at pain because it meant he was being paid. And then, worse than all of it, I saw my son reach into his jacket, pull out an envelope and hand it to the tall one. Money, payment, a transaction quick, professional, and damning. Those are Jake Reed, Rico Sanchez, and Tony Vespa, Marvin said, voice low but steady. Local muscle for hire. They do debt collection, intimidation, and worse, much worse. My own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. This can't be happening. I'm afraid it is, Marvin said, and in his eyes there was no judgment, only grim sympathy.
I had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and for the last 20 years I'd run my little auto shop clean and honest. I'd buried enough men overseas to know the look of killers, and I knew the smell of a setup when it was right in front of me. On the pub's flickering security screen, Lance, my own flesh and blood, was pointing toward the interior, gesturing like some junior commander giving orders to his squad. The 3 men with him nodded in perfect sync, checked their watches, and began to spread out with unsettling precision. One drifted toward the narrow side entrance, another toward the back alley, while the tall one remained stationed near the front, his posture casual but his intent razor-sharp. They're positioning themselves, Marvin murmured beside me, his voice stripped of all warmth. He wasn't speaking like a bartender anymore. He was reading the field, analyzing the enemy's movements like we used to do during reconnaissance briefings. They're creating a perimeter. Whatever your boy told them, they're treating this like a coordinated op. The pub, which had felt cozy just minutes before with its polished wood counters and the low hum of Friday night chatter, now felt suffocating. Every clink of glass carried a hidden threat. Every shadow in the corner seemed to crawl with danger. The television above the bar droned on with baseball commentary, a cheerful announcer oblivious to the fact that somewhere inside this very room a man's death warrant had just been signed. I can't believe Lance would, I began, though the words fell apart on my tongue. Even as I tried to deny it, puzzle pieces began locking into place with sickening clarity. His desperate demands for money, the careful manipulation that had twisted every conversation, the fake reconciliation he'd orchestrated to lure me here tonight, playing the role of dutiful son, all of it had been leading to this. Believe it. Marvin cut me off grimly. His eyes never left the screen. I overheard enough earlier to know. Your son owes serious money to dangerous men, and he's decided your life insurance is a cleaner solution than your savings account. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the bar, the wood sticky beneath my palms. I felt like I'd been gut-punched, like the wind had been stolen from me. This was the boy I'd raised taught to ride a bike, patched up when he scraped his knees, carried upstairs when he fell asleep on the couch, with cartoons still flickering on the TV. That boy, my boy, was now standing outside coordinating my murder like it was just another business deal. What do I do? The words left me in a whisper, so faint I almost wasn't sure I'd spoken them. You get out now. Marvin's reply was immediate, steady and cold as steel. He reached under the counter again, and this time when his hand emerged it carried not a rag or a glass, but a small knife, its blade worn but still sharp. He slid it across the bar to me without flourish. Take this, and listen, whatever happens, don't go home tonight. Find someplace public, someplace they can't corner you. I pocketed the blade with trembling fingers, my skin numb. On the monitor, Lance was shaking hands with Jake Reed, the name Marvin had muttered earlier, an ex-cop gone rotten, now moonlighting as hired muscle. Their handshake was deliberate, final. Then Lance turned back toward the pub's entrance, ready to wear his mask again, the mask of a caring son returning to his father's side. He was sealing the deal to have me killed, and then stepping back inside to smile at me like nothing was wrong. Why are you helping me? I asked Marvin, my voice breaking as I stared at him. At this stranger who seemed more like family in this moment than my own blood. He didn't hesitate. Because 27 years ago a man's father saved my life during a firefight outside Kandahar. His eyes remained locked on the screen, scanning, calculating. And because some things are just right or wrong, blood ties don't change that. I swallowed hard, forcing my throat to work, the words catching like glass shards. Thank you. Marvin gave a single wordless nod, an old soldier's acknowledgement, no need for ceremony, and then he turned back to polishing glasses, slipping effortlessly into the role of a bartender again, as though nothing had transpired. I rose slowly from my stool. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to bolt, to tear through the front door and run for my life. But that instinct would get me killed faster than any bullet. Instead, I forced myself into controlled steps, moving past the pool table, where a pair of college kids bickered over a missed shot, past the corner booth where an old couple nibbled nachos and laughed over shared memories. To them this was just another ordinary night. To me it was life or death. The door to the men's room groaned as I pushed it open, the weight of it dragging at my arm. Inside, the cramped tiled space was harshly lit, clinical, smelling of disinfectant layered over mildew. I locked the door behind me with a metallic click that echoed too loudly. The room was barely 6 feet wide, and high on the back wall was a small frosted glass window, no more than 2 feet across, maybe 18 inches high. My only escape. I gripped the sink, hauled myself up, my knees screaming in protest. The porcelain was slick beneath my palms, my balance wavering. For a second I thought I might topple backward onto the hard tiles, and the thought of dying right there, graceless and broken, nearly paralyzed me. 65 years old. When had I become so fragile? I forced myself forward. The window frame dug into my ribs, tearing my jacket as I shoved through. Beyond, the alley yawned like a dark throat, dumpsters hulking in the shadows. I pushed harder, felt the cold night air rush my face, then dropped. The fall slammed into me, my knees buckling, pain roaring up my spine, but instinct took over. I rolled just as Sergeant Martinez had drilled into us during basic training, and somehow I was still breathing when I came to rest on the damp pavement. The alley stank of garbage, grease and old rain. I pressed myself against the wall, moving low, every step grinding into my joints. Through the brick I could still hear the pub's muffled warmth, laughter, chatter, the clink of glasses. Somewhere inside, my son was probably checking his watch, wondering why I hadn't returned from the bathroom. My son, who had just hired men to end me. The thought should have shattered me, but instead it carved something sharp and cold into my chest. It focused me. At the corner of the building I froze, pressing my back to the rough brick, listening. Voices drifted through the night, male voices, lances among them. The cadence was unmistakable, not casual banter, but low, clipped coordination. Professionals laying out the mechanics of murder. I slid closer, hugging the shadows beneath the overhang of the rear delivery door. My heartbeat thundered, but my breathing was steady now, controlled. The old training was still there, dormant for decades, but alive in my veins again. I crept forward, using the shapes of parked cars as cover, until a Ford pickup provided perfect concealment across from the pub's main entrance. I crouched low behind its bumper, and peered around the tailgate. Under the amber wash of a streetlight stood Lance with 3 hard-eyed men, who looked exactly like what they were, professional killers dressed in casual clothes. The tall one spoke, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders without being questioned. Tomorrow, 8 a.m., make it look like an accident. Brake failure, steering problem, whatever sells. This had to be Reed. Marvin's warning echoed in my mind, and there was my son, nodding eagerly like an obedient student, taking in every instruction. He always parks in the same spot behind his shop, Lance said, his voice low, reverent almost, as if he were reciting the details of a ritual. And that was when I knew my own boy wasn't just complicit, he was the architect. Creature of habit, Lance was saying, his voice light, casual, almost amused. He's been using that space for 20 years. Never changes. Same spot every morning. What kind of car? The stocky one. Rico Sanchez, I remembered Marvin calling him, spoke in a voice that sounded like gravel being churned in a cement mixer. Matters for the setup, Rico added. Old Ford pickup, Lance replied, dismissing my stubborn independence with a shrug that made bile rise in my throat. Probably 10 years old. He's the kind of guy who insists on maintaining it himself. Changes his own oil. Tunes it up in the driveway. All that old-school, stubborn, self-reliant stuff. The way he said it, like my pride, my discipline, my craft, meant nothing more than an inconvenience to be exploited. That casual dismissal of everything I'd built with my own hands cut deeper than any blade. Blue four-door extended cab, he added, as if describing some stranger's vehicle to the DMV. The third man, Tony Vespa, spoke up in a voice so soft, I almost missed it. Security cameras in that area? Few, but nothing covering the lot directly, Lance answered smoothly. Angles are all wrong. Street cameras miss it, and the shop's system focuses on the front entrance, not the employee lot. My stomach turned to ice. They'd thought of everything. This wasn't some desperate robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a hot-headed mistake. This was a surgical execution, planned with military precision, rehearsed like a play. 200 grand is cheap for this kind of work, Rico grumbled, his broad shoulders shifting as he planted his boots wider on the pavement. Usually we get $500,000 for a clean elimination. That's all I've got in cash right now, Lance said quickly, but then his tone softened, smooth as a salesman's pitch. He spread his hands in a gesture of promise. Once the inheritance clears, once the paperwork goes through, we're talking over $1 million in total assets. I'll double your fee then. Jake, the tall one, the leader, spoke next, his voice professional, clipped, dangerous, and if the old man changed his will, the way he asked it, so pointed, so matter-of-fact, it was clear this was business to him. Just another job. He didn't, Lance said, with a confidence that made me sick. I know because I was there. I witnessed it, 3 years ago when Mom passed. Everything comes to me first. If something happens to me, then it goes to Lucinda. That's it. No charities, no mistresses, no surprises. The old man's too sentimental to cut out his only son. Too sentimental. That's what 40 years of love, sacrifice, and sleepless nights had earned me. A reputation for being too sentimental, too soft, too trusting. A weakness to be exploited. Tony shifted, eyes narrowing toward the pub entrance. What about the wife? She going to be a problem afterward? Lucinda. Lance laughed. Actually laughed. That sound, carefree, mocking, stabbed into my chest. She can barely balance a checkbook. She won't ask questions about insurance money or inheritance details. And if she does, he shrugged, casual, cruel, she's not really a problem we can't handle. The coldness of that moment fused something inside me into steel. Lucinda, who had stood in my kitchen and made lasagna for the whole family, trying to keep peace. Lucinda, who thought she'd married into love, not into treachery. She had no idea she was tied to a monster. 7 o'clock tomorrow, Jake said, pulling an envelope from Lance's hand. He opened it, thumbed through the contents, then tucked it into his jacket with the practiced ease of a man who had taken blood money before. We meet at the usual spot, confirm the target's location, then move into position. Clean, simple, no complications. And afterward, Rico asked, his voice like a growl from the shadows. Leave him in the truck, Jake replied, without hesitation. Make it look like he had a heart attack or a stroke behind the wheel. Old guy works too hard, too much stress. Happens all the time. Paramedics won't look too closely at a 70-year-old's ticker giving out 65, I thought bitterly. But what did it matter? To them I was just another old man, disposable. The envelope had changed hands. A contract signed in silence, sealed with betrayal. My son's betrayal. I watched as Lance extended his hand again, this time not to me, not to family, but to Jake Reed, his father's would-be executioner. Their handshake glowed under the streetlight, a moment of radiant treason. Pleasure doing business, Jake said, his tone coldly final. Tomorrow night, your problems disappear. Lance's face split into a smile I hadn't seen in years, broad, genuine, almost boyish. A smile that should have been reserved for Christmas mornings, graduations, the day I'd taught him to ride his bike without training wheels.
but now it shone only for the men who promised to erase me from this earth. "Thank you," he said earnestly. "This means everything to me." That smile was the cruelest cut of all. The men dispersed like wolves melting into the forest. Rico and Tony drifted toward a waiting sedan parked down the block. Jake moved in the opposite direction, his long frame illuminated briefly before he swung a leg over a motorcycle and roared away. Lance lingered under the streetlight for a moment, checking his phone, thumbs moving with practiced ease. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back toward the pub's entrance. He was going back inside, back to the bar, back to Marvin, back to the seat where he would pretend to wait for me, his father, who was supposed to return from the bathroom any moment. But I wouldn't be there. Not anymore. 5 minutes. That's all I had before he started to wonder. Maybe 10, before he asked Marvin if anyone had seen me leave. 15 at most, before his perfect evening unraveled and suspicion started clawing its way toward me. Time was bleeding out fast. I slid from behind the truck, heart pounding, keeping low in the gaps between streetlights. My Ford sat exactly where I'd left it, just beyond the pub's reach, waiting in the dark. Keys were still in my jacket pocket. Thank God Lance hadn't had the chance to tamper with them earlier. I reached the driver's side, every nerve screaming at me to hurry, but every instinct warning me to stay calm. Panic made mistakes. Panic made noise. I slipped behind the wheel, the seat familiar, almost comforting beneath me. My fingers shook as I slid the key into the ignition. "Please," I whispered under my breath. A soldier's prayer, a mechanic's plea. The engine turned over on the first try, rumbling low, steady. No backfire, no stall, small mercy. I eased the truck into gear and pulled away from the curb with the deliberate calm of a man who wanted no one, not even his own son, to notice he was escaping.
The drive back to Lance's house took exactly 14 minutes, a stretch of road winding through Seattle's late-night veins, each passing street lamp slicing the darkness like the second hand of a clock. 14 minutes. That was all the universe gave me to process what I had witnessed, to accept the unthinkable truth that my only son had arranged my murder, and to begin calculating the impossible, what I would do next. My heart carried the weight of betrayal, but my mind, ever the soldier's mind, shifted quickly to logistics. How much time did I have? What resources could I summon? Which innocent lives might be crushed if I misstepped? And above all, Lucinda. Whatever lay rotting between Lance and me, his wife was not to be dragged into this pit of treachery. She deserved safety. She deserved not to become collateral in a war she didn't even know was being waged. I parked 3 houses down from Lance's townhouse, that familiar distance drilled into me years ago during reconnaissance runs in Korea. Old instincts came back like ghosts. They never truly leave you. The neighborhood looked peaceful. A little row of darkened windows and sleeping souls. Ordinary families breathing in the safety of night. But to me this street wasn't quiet. It pulsed with the tension of the most important night of my life. The key Lance had pressed into my palm, just hours earlier, slid smoothly into the lock, that gesture of false trust burning in my memory. The door gave way into the same living room where tonight's catastrophe had begun. The air seemed heavier now, tainted. I stood still, listening. Silence, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking wall clock. Upstairs, Lucinda was surely asleep, curled in blankets, weary after the dinner argument that had carved invisible wounds between us all. She had no idea that her husband was sitting in a pub, likely staring at the bathroom door, wondering why his father had taken so long to return. The guest room no longer felt like sanctuary. It felt hostile, alien, enemy territory. Still, I moved through it with discipline, packing my things with a precision Martha had taught me decades ago when my late shifts at the shop meant creeping into our bedroom without waking her. Each motion calculated, quiet. Blood pressure pills into the toiletry kit, a clean shirt and fresh underwear folded tight in the suitcase. The photograph of Martha, her smile frozen in time, her wisdom still warm in my chest, slipped safely into my wallet. It was as if I were erasing every trace of myself from this house, wiping away my presence like chalk from a blackboard. Before leaving, I sat at the small desk in the corner, pulled out a scrap of paper, and began to write. My handwriting, careful, deliberate. Lucy, your husband is in danger. If you love him, Take the children and go to your mother's house tomorrow morning. Don't ask questions, just leave. Trust me, not the whole truth, but enough truth to keep her alive. I weighted the note beneath the salt shaker on the kitchen counter, where her hand would surely find it during tomorrow's ritual coffee. Then I slipped out, back into my Ford, back into the night. The highway unfurled before me like a dark ribbon leading south, toward Portland, toward whatever awaited me after tonight. I-5 stretched long and nearly empty, just the grumble of 18-wheelers and the occasional late-night drifter keeping me company. The conditions were good, the sky clear, the road dry, 3 hours of solitude to untangle everything I'd learned and everything I feared. The phone rang 20 minutes outside Seattle. Lance's number. I stared at the glowing screen, my son's name, and let it buzz into silence. It rang again 5 minutes later, again 10 minutes after that. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in my chest, but I refused to pick up. By the time I crossed into Oregon, the missed call counter blinked in double digits. By the time I passed the Portland city limit sign, it had reached 37. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the count stood at 47. 47 frantic attempts from the son I once carried on my shoulders, now desperate to salvage his crumbling plan. He must have been panicking, realizing his perfect design had gone to pieces, that the old man he had marked for death had slipped away like smoke into the night. I powered off the phone, slid it into my jacket pocket, and sat still in the car for a moment. The silence of my neighborhood felt different than Seattle's. It was mine, it was familiar, but I no longer felt at home anywhere. Tomorrow, I would have decisions to make: how to shield myself, how to save Lucinda, how to derail 3 professional killers before they collected their blood payment. Tonight, though, I was simply a 65-year-old man who had stumbled upon the truth that his son wanted him dead. My body was tired in ways no sleep could cure. My heart was battered, but it was still beating, and for now, that was enough, because I knew what I was up against, and this war was far from over.